But that, of course, is not a shock because the other foreign policy story yesterday is that the ICC, the International Criminal Court, which if the UN is the Mos Eisley of international politics, a wretched hive of scum and villainy, the ICC is even more wretched given the fact that the United States is not a member. The International Criminal Court was established in 1998 by the so-called Rome Statute. It is an agreement among maybe 124 member states, not including many major countries, including India, the United States, Russia, Israel. A bunch of countries don't make themselves subject to the International Criminal Court, mainly because it's crap. The International Criminal Court suggests that it has jurisdiction over all of its member states. It doesn't have the actual ability to arrest. It has to rely on its member states to arrest people who are prosecuted by the International Criminal Court. Now, for the International Criminal Court to operate, they have to come to agreements, these broad-based agreements with countries like, for example, Venezuela, which is run by a communist henchman who murders thousands of his own citizens, but has not been brought up for prosecution by the ICC. Like the country of Niger, which is currently in the middle of a move to kick out American troops, seize an American airbase, and ally with Russia. They are a member of the ICC. The state of Palestine, which has no legitimate government, is a member of the ICC, presumably under the auspices of the Palestinian Authority in 2015. The United States has not made itself subject to the ICC because currently the ICC is still attempting to investigate American soldiers for actions in Afghanistan with the goal of then arresting American soldiers and throwing them in prison. The United States, as you might imagine, is not real fond of this. So the United States is not interested in watching as Niger and Venezuela prosecute American soldiers. The EU has signed on because the EU, again, in all of its historic moral glory, being responsible for not one but two world wars and the entire essence of colonialism throughout its history, the EU has signed on to the ICC. Now, the difficulty arises when they're members of the ICC who have members of their population who are prosecuted. So what the ICC has historically done is shy away from doing that. So, for example, they did an investigation into UK soldiers who were acting in Afghanistan and Iraq. They got right to the precipice of prosecuting, and then they withdrew. And the reason they withdrew is because they were afraid that they would have alienated the UK government, and the UK government would have pulled away from the ICC. Why is any of this relevant? Because the ICC, in the most disgusting thing I can possibly imagine, actually, they put out joint arrest warrants for the Hamas leader in Gaza, Yahya Sinwar, who's an active war criminal, an evil, murderous, monstrous piece of human debris who orchestrated the murder of 1,200 Israeli citizens, the kidnapping of 250 others, is currently hiding in holes with civilians surrounding him, including women and children. So that's one warrant. And the other warrant they issued on the same day was for the Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, as well as Yoav Gallant, who's the Minister of Defense in Israel, which is insane. Israel, as we've been explaining on the show, has fought the single cleanest urban war in the history of urban warfare by the statistics. And yet the ICC is now treating jointly Yahya Sinwar, a terrorist leader, and a man who was, until very recently, the leader of an actual government in the Gaza Strip that presided over the robbery of his own citizens and the murder of his own citizens and the murder of members of, by the way, ICC states like the PA. They're equating that with Benjamin Netanyahu and the elected government of Israel acting in wartime in self-defense to extirpate the terrorist group. Here's the statement that was put forward by the prosecutor, Karim A.A. Khan. He announced application for arrest warrant in relation to Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant. This is not the final step. Basically, they issue, I love this picture of these ridiculous-looking bureaucrats standing there looking very serious about their ICC, which has no actual enforcement power other than states who willy-nilly decide whether to enforce or not. They've tried this crap, by the way, against Vladimir Putin as well. It has resulted in zero things. The only people who have ever been successfully prosecuted in the 20 years that the ICC has been in existence, they've prosecuted like 20 people. And they're all basically warlords from Africa. In any case, here was this ridiculous human being declaring his issuance for arrest warrants.
I can also confirm today that I have reasonable grounds to believe, on the basis of evidence collected and examined by my office, that Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Minister of Defense Yoav Gallant bear criminal responsibility for the following international crimes committed on the territory of the State of Palestine from at least the 8th of October 2023. The crimes include starvation of civilians as a method of warfare, willfully causing great suffering, serious injury to body or health or cruel treatment, willful killing or murder, and intentionally directing attacks against a civilian population, as well as crimes against humanity.
Every single one of those elements is a lie. Every single one of those elements is a lie. When he suggests deprivation of humanitarian assistance, Israel has been shipping in hundreds of trucks every single day for humanitarian assistance. Understand, this guy is just a tool of the radical left in Europe, the international political community, which is dominated by Israel haters and anti-Semites. I mean, that's what this guy is, obviously. It's an absurdity on every possible level for it to be absurd. Let me ask you two questions that make clear how absurd this is. So October 7th obviously happens. It is now May 20th. Why are they issuing the arrest warrants for Sinwar and Netanyahu on the same day? They could have issued an arrest warrant for Sinwar literally the next day. The state of Palestine is a signatory member of the ICC, even though it doesn't exist. Why didn't they do that? The reason is because they wanted to create a false narrative in which there is a quote-unquote cycle of violence between a legitimately elected democratic government fighting a self-defense war and a terrorist group. That is point number one. Point number two. One of the things that I've said a couple of times, because it's true, is the state of Palestine, which again does not exist, is in some weird way, like the state of unicorns, a member of the ICC. What that means, theoretically, is that any state that is a member of the International Criminal Court has an obligation to arrest people who are issued warrants under the International Criminal Court. What efforts have been made by the state of Palestine to arrest Yahya Sinwar, who is in the territory of Gaza that is under the jurisdiction of the ICC? Any? Bueller? All of this is clearly an absurdity. There, again, is a reason the United States is not a member of the ICC. And it's because the United States does not wish to make itself subject to the absolute moral imbecility of a bunch of international bureaucrats who have no connection with morality or decency. What's weird about the ICC is that it sort of lives in this weird space between two theories of law. So theory of law number one is a historically based theory called natural law. Natural law theory is what undergirds the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. Natural law theory is the idea that there is written into the code of humanity and into the code of nature certain laws, like do not murder. Thou shalt not murder is not merely a command from God. It is also written into the natural law in the sense that everyone can suss out what that law is. And the typical idea of natural law has been that it trumps laws that violate the natural law. This is the claim that is made in the Declaration of Independence, for example. So when the Declaration of Independence says that there are laws that violate our natural rights, what it means is that we then have the duty to actually rebel against those laws. Okay, so natural law is the idea that, again, there is this broad-based law that is universal to humanity. Then there's the theory called legal positivism. Legal positivism is the theory that there is no law except what governments say there is. And so if a government makes a law, it can be a justified law or an unjustified law, but the law is only, there is no natural law. There is only law that is established by governments. Thus, claiming that you are rebelling in the name of a natural law, a higher law, is a lie. What's weird about the ICC is that it sort of lives in this netherworld between the two. So it claims that it speaks in the name of a universal human rights law that does not exist according to the ICC. Because if it did exist according to the ICC, Venezuela would be prosecuted, obviously. The leaders of Niger would be prosecuted, obviously. So obviously they don't believe in natural law, but they're also not really legal positivists because they have no power. The ICC has no actual enforcement power. The entire institution is a complete joke. The United States, formed in the aftermath of World War II, was involved in forming a concept of the world that actually was false. It was the concept that there was an international community that was going to punish wrongdoers. This was tried by Woodrow Wilson, by the way, in the aftermath of World War I, under the auspices of the League of Nations. And wiser politicians at the time in the United States said, we are not going to do this because it is a waste of time. It will bind us to a bunch of garbage that means nothing. So we're just not going to do it. That was the correct move. In the aftermath of World War II, the United States again tried the Wilsonian attempt to craft an international community, including, by the way, its enemies like Russia, which suddenly sat on the UN Security Council. It was a giant failure. The UN has been a giant failure since inception because it turns out any organization is only going to be as virtuous as the collective of its constituent members. If you have an election in the Gaza Strip, you will get Hamas. If you have an election in Florida, you'll get Ron DeSantis. That doesn't mean that all elections are equivalent, because they're not. The same thing is true of bodies. And when it comes to international bodies, NAFTA is not going to look the same as the ICC. So this bizarre notion that the United States and the West had in the aftermath of World War II, that there was such a thing as a community of nations, has always been a lie. International law has always been a lie. International law, as the author Leon Uris once suggested, is the thing that is disobeyed by the cruel and ignored by the kind. That is effectively what is happening here with the ICC. So what can the United States do? Well, we don't pay for the ICC. The ICC, again, we're not members of it. India's not a member. Russia's not a member. A bunch of countries are not members of the ICC. So the United States can apply secondary pressure, as we should, because it's a joke, which means that China's not a member of the ICC. So basically, every major country is not a member of the ICC. It's a bunch of Europeans and a bunch of African countries and some Middle Eastern countries, but not the ones that would actually really be important to prosecute. So really, well done. So what is the ICC? Well, it's basically just a left-wing narrative machine for a bunch of bureaucrats based in The Hague with no actual enforcement power other than the power of these nations. So why does that matter? Well, one, it creates all sorts of fun narratives for people who hate Jews. Equating Hamas with the Israeli government is, in fact, an attempt to put the Jews in the dock alongside terrorists, which is insane. And that's clearly what's happening here. That's number one. Number two, it actually makes negotiations significantly more difficult, because now every ICC member, if indeed this prosecution moves forward, every ICC member state will have an obligation under the Rome Statute to arrest Yoav Gallant, for example, the Minister of Defense in Israel, or Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel. If Bibi, for example, goes to visit Britain, the UK is a signatory to this. The UK would then have an obligation under the Rome Statute to arrest the sitting prime minister of a democratically elected state. Already, this has provided an impediment to any sort of negotiation or talk with, say, Vladimir Putin in Russia. And of course, it's not really enforced, is the truth, because thanks to Zoom, thanks to all of these other mechanisms, you can still have conversations. But this is going to create a much more serious problem, because the Israeli government has already said, we understand who's initiating all of this. The people initiating all of this are the Palestinian Authority, working through their man, who is this prosecutor, Karim Khan. And so they're going to cut off the taxpayer funding to the Palestinian Authority, which theoretically could collapse the Palestinian Authority in Judea and Samaria, the West Bank. The Palestinian Authority, which, by the way, is supposed to have jurisdiction over the state of Palestine, wherein they are arresting 0 terrorists under the ICC's jurisdiction. Beyond which, if the Palestinian Authority, let's say that Netanyahu travels to Ramallah to have some sort of peace conversation with the Palestinian Authority leadership, which is not in the cards anytime in the near future, but let's say it were to be, the Palestinian Authority would then have the legal impetus under the ICC to arrest Netanyahu. You understand how insane all of this is? So what the United States should probably do is impose secondary sanctions on the ICC. If the ICC goes forward with this, we should not have allies of the United States as Americans prosecuted by the ICC. There's a reason, again, we are not members of the ICC. Frankly, it shouldn't have taken this for us to destroy the ICC. The ICC is a garbage institution that should have 0 legal legitimacy. The reason the ICC, by the way, has never prosecuted American soldiers is because they know the United States will actually do just this. They're cowards in the end. And so the fact is that the ICC should be deprived of all international legitimacy because, frankly, it is a giant, giant joke. Okay, meanwhile,